It's really my pleasure to introduce him. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Evansville. He's a native of Mount Kisco, New York. He holds a Bachelor of Arts from Trinity College in Connecticut and a PhD in philosophy from Michigan State University. I'm a graduate of the Ohio State University, so I enjoy the regular wins of the Buckeyes against Spartans. Dick's been a member of the UE faculty since 1971, having also served as a visiting professor at the University of Pittsburgh. He received the university's Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award in 1994 and the Sidney and Stadell Berger Award for Service in 1998. Both of those are very prestigious awards on our campus. Dick has authored articles on the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume and the philosophy of religion, and has presented papers on a variety of issues in ethics and applied ethics. Dick has also participated in an ethics seminar at Dartmouth College associated with the Human Genome Project. At UE, he's taught courses such as philosophy of law, philosophy of science, bioethics, and environmental ethics. He's an outstanding teacher. He's an insightful thinker. Dick's not afraid to stir the pot, to ask the tough questions of his students, or occasionally of colleagues or administrators, to ensure, as I've noted here, that the light of clear-headed thinking illuminates our learning and our decision-making. Very valuable member of the faculty in that regard. Dick is also a dedicated and skilled golfer, and I've had the privilege to join him on the links a number of times. I keep reminding Dick, however, that the object of the game is to have the lowest score. I confess that I'm as intrigued as you are. I didn't say titillated. Intrigued by the title of his talk, and I know that we won't be disappointed. Please welcome Professor Dick.
At a putter I am, and I appreciate him not doing that. I did remark to Dr. Kazee earlier that when I first came to U of E, when we retired, the administration would give us a set of luggage to take on our trips after we retired. We, of course, were much more careful with our budget these days, and apparently, since I'm going to retire at the end of this year, this is what we're getting now. And Tom says, well, this is so you travel lightly. I'm really pleased to be here. The title of this talk, I have to say, is a borrowed title. Some years ago, I think about a decade ago, there was a very interesting NOVA program that was put on the air on PBS that was called 18 Ways to Make a Baby. And it's, you can still get access to it. You can purchase it if you like. It's a very interesting film. A few things have happened since then in the last 10 years, but the basics are explored pretty well there. And if you look it up on a website, you'll see some very interesting connections about all the different techniques and who's doing them and where they're doing them and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, 18 Ways to Make a Baby, only one of them is really fun. And I won't go into any detail. I think most of you are old enough to know what one way is. The other 17 involve some kind of technology in one way or another. If I remember how to do this. Okay. Let me just kind of run through these rather quickly. You get 18 by actually doing a lot of different permutations and combinations on IVF, on in vitro fertilization, natural sex. We won't need to go into that. This is a public place. Artificial insemination, which is sort of the simplest method. We used to, in the old days, call this the turkey baster method. Essentially, you introduce a father's sperm into the uterus. This is often done if for example, there's issues with respect to low sperm production on the part of the father. You can artificially inseminate the mother using donor sperm if, for example, that turns out to be the only way to reproduce. Artificial insemination with an egg and sperm donors, which is becoming more common, and even with a surrogate mother, having someone else actually give birth to the child. You can use in vitro fertilization using the egg and sperm of the parents. This would be the more straightforward way. One of the more interesting techniques is IVF using what's called ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And what they do here, this is usually, again, when there's a very, very low sperm count and you actually catch a sperm and inject it, actually physically inject it into the egg. The first time this was done, it was an accident. And the thought was that this particular embryo would not develop normally because the cell wall had been broken and so on. It turned out it was the best one of all, and it was the one that made it. So apparently, eggs are pretty strong, I guess. IVF using frozen embryos, IVF with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. I'll talk a little bit about this later. This is, if you have a concern about passing on some particular genetic problem, you might be able to screen or test the embryos that you create in a dish to see if there are any that have that gene. This creates lots of moral issues for people because it ends up discarding certain embryos. But I'll talk about a case actually with one of my students that may give a little different light on that. You can use IVF with a donor egg, for example, donor sperm, both egg and sperm donor, surrogate mother using parent's egg and sperm, surrogate with an egg donor, surrogate with a sperm donor, surrogate using her egg, sperm from a baby's father, surrogate using egg and sperm donor, cytoplasmic transfer. This is an interesting development. It first was done because of a woman who was having a very difficult time carrying pregnancies. And one of the things they found when they would look at the embryos, that the embryos would start to divide, and then they would fragment. So they started to remove the fragments and see if it would develop more naturally, and it would start to develop and then either fragment again, or the woman would lose the pregnancy. Well, what they found out was, at least the theory is, that the problem was not with the husband's sperm. The problem wasn't actually with her nuclear DNA. It was with the mitochondria. Mitochondria, providing the energy for cell division, has DNA in it as well, and that was apparently the problem, because what they ended up doing was taking another woman's egg, denucleating it, taking the nucleus out, and then using the process of ICSI, injecting the cytoplasm of this woman's egg into the intended mother. And it worked. And the child is quite healthy. She must be pretty close to 12 or 13 years old now, doing quite well, thank you very much. So here you have now a person that has DNA from 3 different people. Has DNA obviously from the mother and the father, and has some mitochondrial DNA from the woman whose egg cytoplasm was injected into the woman's egg. So it's quite a complicated process. And then, of course, the one we all live in fear of, I guess, I don't know, I think sometimes irrationally so, cloning. So that gets 18, and as far as I know, that's still the number. But who knows, it could change. It could change at almost any time. Just some of the terminology: artificial insemination, obviously, is pretty clear. What in vitro fertilization, essentially using a petri dish in various combinations. I mentioned ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, which is used now not only to introduce sperm, but where you can actually transfer the cytoplasm from one egg to another. Frozen embryos, sometimes used. The success rate is not so good with them as it is with others, although sometimes people will have embryos frozen in case the ones they try to use don't work, or we'll see later on, sometimes for somewhat bizarre reasons. I mentioned pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and so on. What I do in my class, I teach this course, and I usually try to, after we just go over some terminology and processes and success rates and lack of rates and so on, I usually try to give them some horrible cases about terrible things that have happened. One of the problems is, of course, that state laws differ on questions like who's the mother. Some states would say the woman who gives birth to the child is the mother. So if you use a surrogate in a state like that, the surrogate mother is the mother, and the legal parenting is handled by sort of like adoption process. There's questions about surrogacy contracts. Are they legally binding? Typically not. They're agreements. You sit down and write up an agreement, and you take that seriously, but they may not be enforced by courts. And there's also the question about whether surrogates should be paid. Do you pay surrogates? I call it rent-a-womb. Do you pay surrogates? What does that do? What does that say about mothering and having children and families and all this kind of stuff? Should the surrogates have a relationship with the child they gave birth to? I often will tell a story about, it's a true story, more or less, but about a young woman who was hired to serve as a surrogate for a couple. She became, as it were, attached to the child, both literally and figuratively, and decided she wanted to keep the child. So she went to a state where the law was that the birth mother is the mother of the child, because she wanted to keep the child. The woman was somewhat unstable, probably didn't do a good job of picking her, because she did not have children of her own. So there was a question about how well she could handle pregnancy and so on. So I do a few cases like that, and then I ask my students, if you were running a reproductive clinic, would you allow the surrogates to have a relationship with their birth child? And no, because they're thinking about all these horrible cases that I just talked about. And one year I do this, and this young lady in the back row raises her hand and she says, "Oh, I disagree with that." She says, I was a surrogate birth. Now, you're beginning to find this stuff now, and it's like, whoa. I was a surrogate birth, and my birth mother was my aunt. My mother, for physical reasons, couldn't carry a pregnancy to term, so they used IVF with her father's sperm and her mother's egg, and her mother's sister served as a surrogate. And she said, I've known that for as long as I can remember, and it's wonderful. It's like having two mothers. And to know that my mother's sister was willing to do this for her and for me. So then the other kids are going, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. And that's, I think, as much a tale of all this as I could say, a more sort of representative tale, because that's, people don't think about all the different possibilities. There are horror stories out there, but there are also others like that. The lawyers have a kind of a saying that hard cases make bad law. The last thing in the world you want to do is take the most bizarre cases, which, by the way, mostly come from California, the most bizarre cases, and try to make the law to take care of those. And you often end up making a serious mistake in doing that. This is more on the techniques. What I often do after we talk about all this with my students is to have them set up in little groups. Suppose you want to start a reproductive clinic. What services would you provide? In terms of what services do you think it would be profitable to provide? You don't want to lose money. Even if you're a nonprofit, right? You still don't want to lose money. Questions about which of these techniques do you think it's ethical to use? That becomes a question as well. And we get quite a bit of discussion. This is probably one of the most bizarre cases, and this is one I always have my students talk about, and it comes from California. Seems that this was a couple that, and I don't know what all the medical reasons, and they may not have all been medical, but for whatever reason couldn't have children. So what they ended up doing was having donated sperm, donated egg, and a surrogate. Well, turns out that before the child was born, about a month before the child was born, pregnancy was going along just fine. The couple got divorced. Now, when I read about this case, the only thing I say, the only person in here who seemed to be behaving like an adult was actually the surrogate, who was willing to give birth to the child and said she would care for it until the court decided what to do. Well, the mother, the intended mother, Mrs. Bizanca, Luann I think her name was, she wanted to keep the child. But the father, or her husband, who had of course since divorced her, claimed, we guys are not very helpful, decided he didn't want to have any responsibility for this child. After all, he wasn't the father. He certainly wasn't the husband of the woman who gave birth to the child. It wasn't his sperm, so he has no biological connection to this kid whatsoever. So he wanted to claim he had no financial responsibility either. He wasn't the legal father. Now, the trial court, now everybody who criticizes judges, please remember, trial court means jury. The jury decided that this kid had no parents, no legal parents, even though there were donor sperm, donor egg, surrogate, the contracted mother and father. There were 5 people involved in the production of this kid, and yet the court ruled, or the jury ruled, that this child had no parents. Fortunately, there was an activist judge in California who said on appeal, hey, wait a minute, no, this guy is financially responsible for this child. So the mother, Luann Bizanca, his ex-wife, raised the child. And it's usually about this point that I tell students, remember, hard cases make bad law. So don't try to write the law based on this. You might want to try to prevent this sort of thing, but you're going to end up throwing out, as it were, bad pun, but the baby with the bathwater if you follow that. Another question that arises is, who owns frozen embryos? Here's a couple. They got married. They decided to undergo IVF. When they found out that the wife was infertile, they harvested eggs, joining them with Brian's sperm. They created several viable blastocysts, and not typically, but what often happens is some of those might be frozen and stored in case the ones they pick don't work. That, by the way, decreases, as I understand, the likelihood that you'll be able to conceive with frozen embryos, but it's still possible. Unfortunately, none of those embryos implanted, and subsequent test efforts were fruitless as well. So they decide not to discard the frozen embryos at that point, but ask that they be kept until some later date. Some years later, they were divorced. The husband wanted to donate the remaining embryos for research purposes, and she wanted to keep them, thinking that perhaps she might want to undergo IVF later. So the question then becomes, who owns these eggs? Or who owns these, not the eggs, who owns these embryos at this point? Do they both own them? Does just she own them? I mean, and who has the responsibility or who has the right to decide what to do with them? I guess the lesson for that is if you get divorced, get rid of the frozen embryos. I mean, it's sort of like, get rid of those secret bank accounts and the frozen embryos. Something like that. This is one that's a little bit unusual. Here's a couple that had been trying to have a baby for quite some time. Her husband was, the husband, Mr. Scott, was diagnosed with lung cancer. They advised him if they wanted to have children that he should store his sperm because of the difficulties that would arise because of radiation treatment and so on. So his sperm were stored for subsequent use. Mrs. Scott began her first IVF treatments in 2002, but despite 3 further attempts, she did not conceive. She went for her 5th attempt, knowing it was her last because she had used up the sperm. She learned she was pregnant through a home testing kit, but this was 2 years to the day after her husband died. So the question is, I mean, some people might feel sort of creepy. Is it okay to give birth to her dead husband's son created by these technologies? Or is it no different than, a normal reproduction and the process in the time span the husband dies before the child? We wouldn't have a problem with that, but we might have a problem. At least some people might have a problem with this. I mentioned the Whitehead case. This was the woman who took off with the baby to a state where the birth mother could be the mother and created lots of difficulty. I mentioned the student I had in class with a surrogate birth. I have another student, actually have her right now, and I asked, she wrote an essay for me in which she talked about her condition. And when we were discussing this in class this semester, actually just a couple of weeks ago, she has a genetic condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, and it's a quite serious bone problem, and her bones are very brittle, they break very easily, she's very, very short, she's wheelchair bound, she's had hosts of fairly serious surgeries all her life. She said she's been thinking that she would like to probably at some point in her life have a child that is her genetic child. But there are a couple of problems, not the least of which is she cannot carry a pregnancy. Physically, she cannot carry a pregnancy to term, so she would have to use a surrogate. She also wants to use IVF and use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to create embryos in vitro, and you can test to see if an embryo carries this disease. Now, what's not unusual, but not necessarily typical, this disease is autosomal dominant. So that basically means that 50% of any children she has, regardless of the genetic condition of her husband or the father, 50% of her children will likely have this disease. And she said she did not want to have a child with the disease that she had, that it would be extremely difficult for her in her condition to raise a child in that situation. She's aware of the strain that this had on her parents and her family, so she said she would rather not do that. So she said, what I would like to do is use a surrogate, use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis so I could have a child that was genetically related to me. So people have problems with this ethically. Not so much, is she capable of raising children? Trust me, I know this girl. She's more capable of raising children than most of the other women in the class. But the question is, what about discarding embryos because they have this condition? And where do we draw the line here? When do we stop doing this and start designing babies? I mean, the technology is getting to the point where we can begin to do a little bit of that. So, interesting question. One of the more intriguing discussions we have is over paid surrogates. Surrogates are often paid in the U.S. as well, and they can be anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 or $20,000, not counting the medical expenses. People go to quite considerable lengths to have children, and oftentimes they'll have a surrogate that will be paid. These might well be women who, for example, typically they want to make sure they've had children, so they are, they've carried pregnancies to term, they know what that means, and so on. And sometimes these might be women who have several children at home, could use the income. So for a period of time, they could stay home with their children, have some income, and be able to help somebody else. So that's not unusual. As I mentioned before, quite often the surrogates turn out to be family members or friends. This is, by the way, not out of the ordinary for same-sex couples. Suddenly with this technology, you could have two gay men who might have a friend who would be willing to serve as a surrogate. Sometimes the surrogate may also use her eggs. Sometimes the eggs might be donated by somebody else. So suddenly you have a possibility of having same-sex couples that could have children genetically connected to them. Or just single people might choose. A woman might choose to have a child but is not married, has no intention to get married, but wants to have a child genetically connected with her and doesn't want to go out to the singles bars to find out how to do that. This is a little safer, Some of these things get quite bizarre. People go to these sperm and egg donor banks and start picking looking at the picture, how tall was this guy, and what color was her hair, and I just kind of freak out myself when I say, well, I only want Christians. I didn't know there was a gene for, Christianity or Judaism and so on, but people will actually, sometimes make these kind of strange choices. Well, there's an interesting business that's operated. Probably one of the more successful ones is a quite large clinic, a reproductive clinic in India, which specializes in providing surrogates for wealthy Indian couples, European couples, and American couples. They recruit young Indian women, typically, well, I shouldn't say typically, virtually always poor young Indian women to serve as surrogates. The clinic operates, how can I say, efficiently. They make sure that these women are relatively young. They're all in their 20s, not too young, but certainly not too old. And then make sure that they've had children, so that they have a good, so to speak, track record at having children. They know what that's like. They provide them with a substantial, certainly by Indian standards, substantial payment, sometimes $7,000 to $10,000 or $12,000. That's a fortune. That's a house that these women might not have been otherwise able to afford. That's an education for their children. So, the doctor who runs this clinic she says, this is a win-win all the way around. These women are financially better off. They get great medical care. They get fed, get great diet and all that stuff during that pregnancy. They get money that they wouldn't otherwise have. Couples in the U.S., elsewhere, can have these kind of services for less than they would have to pay, Deaconess or pay an American clinic. Terrific, great, win-win situation. But of course, people have real concerns, and I understand that, about turning women into commodities. It's like, you're hiring these women because they're incubators, rent a womb, as I say. And some people have a lot of trouble with that. There's a very interesting book, not about this topic only, but by Michael Sandel, I regret to say, who's actually a political scientist, much like Dr. Kazee, who has written a book recently called What Money Can't Buy, and talks about the turning so many things into commodities that used to be, things you did out of the goodness of your heart. He calls it the sky boxification of America, where people don't sit and watch a game all out in the sun and the rain. All the rich people sit up in their boxes. So, are we turning women into commodities? It's very interesting to listen to women philosophers, feminists, who argue about this, because they're on both sides of these questions. On the one hand, they want to allow women to have freedom of choice and so on, but on the other hand, they have some reservations about turning women into commodities. So not an easy matter. And throughout all of this stuff, I always tell my students, remember the lawyer's adage that hard cases make bad law. But I don't think we've come near yet to sorting out what we should do here. What sort of regulations should we have? Should we have regulations on certain things? It's very, very difficult, but it's a brave new world out there, I think, with reproductive technology. And I'll stop, I think, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to do what I can. Yeah.
Does for lack of better words, the quality of the surrogate make any difference? Obviously, you'd like someone who's healthy.
Right.
But,
well, obviously it makes, and not only that, but that they're not going to make bad life choices that would threaten the health of the fetus, for example. Yeah.
Habits,
right.
Their diet and all that
right.
sort of thing have to enter into it. Have there been any studies about that in terms of how it might affect the personality of the child if they have a surrogate that is entirely different from the mother?
Yeah, not that I know of. I mean, as far as screening to make sure that, keep in mind these folks are in it for it's a business for them. I mean, the
Sure.
people offering the clinic, so they're usually pretty careful about making sure that the surrogates they use are healthy, they try to avoid the whitehead case where they're likely to be maybe unstable or inclined to kind of renege on the deal at the last minute. So they do try to do a pretty good job there. I don't offhand know of any studies that have shown that. And oftentimes the surrogate may give birth to the child, but the egg and the sperm might still, and are often still the egg and sperm of the intended parents. So whatever problems they have are inherited from their genetic parents. But as far as, if you're using donated eggs, people do, well, if they go to an egg donor, a bank, they'll get information about the person whose egg this is. What their physical characteristics are. Usually it's health issues that are of most concern. But you get some people who say, well, I want this one because her SAT score, literally, I'm not kidding, I couldn't make this stuff up. Her SAT score was higher than this one, so I want to use that woman's eggs. Or this one went to Yale, and this one went to UE, so we want UE, of course. But there's sometimes, and then that gets almost to my way of thinking, just kind of a silly thing. But they do that. I think the real, as yet, really kind of untested area is what happens if things go wrong. For example, do I get to say, I wanted a healthy baby. I didn't want a baby with this condition. How bound are you to take the merchandise, so to speak? Or what if the pregnancy gets difficult? Who has the right to decide whether this pregnancy should be terminated or not? The woman who's carrying the child, or the couple that's, unloaded tens of thousands of dollars to create this child? So that's a problem. There's a problem for some people who have difficulty, even if you don't have difficulties with the petri dish embryos and stuff. Some people think that's the same as abortion, maybe even worse, because there's greater destruction of life. But if you have difficulties with abortion from a moral or religious point of view, it's not unusual for clinics to implant several embryos. Tom was telling me a story the other day about somebody that had 8 embryos implanted and ended up with triplets. Some clinics will ask people ahead of time, look, we want to implant more than 2 or 3 because statistically you're not going to get 2 or 3. You're going to get 1 if you're lucky. I mean, even now, in the best of circumstances, these techniques are only about 50% successful. They used to be 30, not 10 years ago. If you have the fortune, good or bad, depends on your point of view, that, oh my God, you get 4 that are developing. Well, some clinics will request that people in advance agree to fetal reduction, because the more, if it's a multiple birth, there's just that much greater chance that there'll be problems with the children, developmental problems, both cognitive, physical, and so on. So there are clinics that will say, we want to limit 2. 3 is pushing it, 4, real big problem. There's the octomoms of the world who seem to, grow up like blimps and have multiple births, and they all seem to be, as far as anybody knows, fairly healthy. But that's a difficult question. You decide, especially for these couples that have tried. Some of them tried and failed, and suddenly they're having 3 or 4. By God, they want the multiple. They've done all this. They wanted kids, and they'll do that. These can be problematic pregnancies. That's a tough issue. There are no easy questions here, I don't think. I don't answer your question, but just to say, well, there's 3 other questions that crop up.
Oh,
yeah.
I knew there were. I was just wondering whether anyone explored them.
Not that part. Not that I know of. I mean, that doesn't mean it hasn't been done, but not that I know of.
How do these differ from cloning?
Well,
it seems like kind of around the edge of cloning.
Yeah, because some of the techniques can be used, like being able to remove cytoplasm. For example, the whole point of cloning is to take the nucleus of a somatic cell, stick it into a denucleated egg, and then try to get the egg to divide. Somebody asked me once, why would anyone want to clone? You know, I mean, I guess I know farmers who would like to clone if they get a good, you know, good egg layer. Let's have the same one again. But why would a person want to clone themselves? And my students are not ready to go along with that yet. They're still pretty uncomfortable with that process. But I suppose, you know, if your family history has a serious genetically connected health issue and you want to have a child that's genetically connected with one of the parents, say, that's not affected by that, this might be a way of having a child that's genetically connected only to that couple, that is only to that one person. We're nowhere near doing that yet, but I mean, I think it'll probably happen. I'd be really surprised if at some point in the future this doesn't happen. I mean, there are some real safety technical issues about this. Dolly the sheep, for example, aged rather quickly. There's some suggestion that using the nucleus of a somatic cell, an older cell, that's a serious problem for premature aging, for example. But I think if those technical difficulties are taken care of, we'll see it at some point. I mean, I hope that we don't see it just because somebody wants to do something bizarre, but sometimes my students have a hard time thinking clones aren't like zombies, you know, and I said, no, they're just twins, you know. How many times you know identical twins? I have identical twins in my class this semester. They drive me crazy because they look alike, they dress alike, they wear their hair alike, and they refuse to ever tell me who's who when I'm passing stuff back. So but really that's what it is. It's a twin, an identical twin, except separated by more than a couple of minutes. Separated by, but you know, people say, you know, you're going to put pressure on the kid, you're creating this kid to be just like you, and if the kid isn't just like you, you know, there's going to be problems for the kids. And whenever I hear that argument, I always want to say, that's what you call bad parenting. I know parents who created kids the old-fashioned way, and they're horrible. They have demands on their kids that are unrealistic and so on. So, you know, I think a lot of this is I think requires just good counseling if you're going to run a clinic ethically, to make sure people understand what they're facing. Yeah, Tom.
One of the points of emphasis is that hard cases make bad law,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's true. But I worry that we find ourselves almost forced into that situation because these issues don't arise oftentimes until there's a circumstance, a
Right.
case, and that case highlights a particular concern, and so then the court rules something, and that ruling then begins to define the law in
Mm-hmm.
particular area. It's not like we sat down absent real cases.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And said, sort of from a philosophical perspective, for
Mm-hmm.
example, or even a jurisprudential perspective, what is good law?
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we were reacting.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, as far as you know, any sort of more proactive approach to this that's been tried in states, or the states being kind of laboratories for legal innovation? Get out in front
Yeah,
of this.
yeah. I mean, there have been efforts. Part of the problem is that these are all done within the states, so states vary quite a bit from one to the other. Frankly, I think there's not going to be a really careful discussion of this until we, I mean, till we, I don't know if we can separate the abortion issues from the reproductive technology issues. The Catholic Church, for example, is opposed to all of these methods, with one strange exception, which is a process called gift. And my students think it's creepy. They think it's much creepier than cloning, almost. But it involves, because the whole idea is you want to keep the connection between the conjugal act, as it's referred to, and birth. So you have, the couple will have sex, you know, number one way, a natural way, and they'll use a condom with holes punched in it. on the outside chance that fertilization will occur naturally. You've had harvested eggs from the mother. After sex, you immediately take the condom, empty the contents into a dish where there's an egg, and then you just introduce that whole mess, pardon me, into the woman's uterus. You don't fertilize or arrange for fertilization in the dish, because that would involve a third party in the process, and that would be unnatural. It would be outside. So that's the only one. But I think as long as we keep thinking, discarding embryos, picking embryos to implant, not to implant, as long as we have problems with, surrogate parenting and so on, and if the abortion debate hangs over all this, we're probably not going to ever get law on this. I mean, one just hopes that the clinics, in the interest of having safe, successful procedures, will do a good bit of self-regulation. But they're going to make money on the basis of how successful they are in creating babies, and that's going to encourage more multiple implantations, fetal reduction, and things like that, because you want people to have healthy babies. That's what they're paying you all these big bucks for. So I don't have a crystal ball. I'm a philosopher, not a soothsayer, so I don't know. But yeah, you're right. These cases come up like Octomom, and so we decide, oh my God, we have to protect ourselves from having that happen again.
Well, the example you referred to is a friend of ours who they tried to conceive for years and hadn't had success, so they went to a fertility clinic. This was back in the school, and or at least new.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually had 8 fertilized eggs implanted into triplets.
Mm-hmm.
What is the legal status, or in light of the way some people think about these issues? What about those 5 that weren't viable? And did she have some responsibility to protect their viability?
Right.
It's a very muddy.
Right. How about the age of parents? I think the record now is 63 years old. A woman who was 63, and most clinics have age limits. They won't take clients. She's a mother, 63 years old, and she lied about her age when she went to the clinic. So they had an age limit of, like, it was either 50 or 55, and so they did, and went ahead, and she gave birth to a perfectly healthy child, who will, by the way, be 17 years old when her mother and father, both the same age, are 80. I mean, adoption agencies won't let older folks adopt for just those kinds of reasons, and so we have to be, a little bit careful about that. In the paper, not too long ago, there was a case of you ready for this? A grandmother who gave birth to her own grandchild. Her daughter could not carry a pregnancy to term, so the grandmother, who was about in her 50s, went through the process so she could, the hormone treatments thicken the walls of the uterus and so on, so she could carry her daughter and son-in-law's child to term. And she did, gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby. So it's like, wait a minute. Grandmother gives birth to depending on what the state is, I suppose you could say the grandmother is the mother of record of that child. If she goes to Tennessee, where at that time anyway, the law was that birth mother is the mother. It's, things are changing. I mean, birth mother is the mother. It's, things are changing. I mean, I don't think it's going to stop. I mean, I think it's still a very small percentage of the number of births, obviously. We still prefer doing it the old-fashioned way, and we don't need a lot of instruction, apparently, but it's going to happen more and more often. Gattaca, the movie, is kind of on the mark, in a way. Yeah.
So we both work for physicians in reproductive medicine, and the physicians that we work for currently from Harvard University. I think reproductive medicine has come a long way since the first IVF birth in the 70s. But as far as them, and you know, of course, you always want to pick an ethical doctor, but most
Right.
of them follow the guidelines of ASRM,
Mhm.
which is the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. A lot of, I don't know any physicians, you know, the octomom, you have one physician that kind of makes a bad name for everyone.
right.
He no longer has his
Right,
license to
right,
practice.
right.
The physicians that we work for, I mean, typically they do single embryo transfers,
Mhm.
and their success with that, as well as a frozen embryo transfer, is nearly as good as fresh.
Right.
So it is really their practice that they typically only put back 2 embryos regardless of what the
Right,
patient
right,
says.
right.
And again, that's based on the grade of the embryo, but I've
Mhm.
never known anybody to put back 4 or 5 or 6
Mhm.
embryos just because that's what the patient wants.
Right, right.
In
Right.
this area, not
Yeah,
to
right,
say that
right,
it doesn't
right,
happen, but you
right.
always have some people who don't
Yeah.
follow, or who are maybe, you know, unethical.
Well,
as
partly
you would
because,
want.
at least the last figure I saw, and this is, of course, covers all of the techniques, it's about 50% successful, which has improved from about 20 or about 30% 10 years ago. So it is
But
better,
infertility
yeah.
affects, you know,
Oh.
sometimes 1 in 3, 1
Yeah.
in 4
Yeah.
people, so
Not
that, you know,
uncommon.
it's come a
Mhm.
a
And
long
people,
way with.
yeah, one of the things I like to talk to my students about is, do they think it's a disease? You know? And typically our students who haven't started, at least most of them, I don't think, haven't started having babies yet.
And people are waiting
They
later in
think, oh, it's just a condition. It's not a disease. But if you talk to women and couples who have suffered from infertility, they have a very different point of view. They think of it very much as a disease. You know, that's right. But if you're running a clinic, you know, and you're going to be measured publicly by your success rate, is what induces people to do more than 2 implantations. So try to up the odds, and that's a real, you know, that's an ethical issue. It seems to me. You're quite right. Yeah, I suppose somebody once said, "Is there any problem with all this techniques?" Yeah, we might be passing on the gene for infertility. If infertile couples have to use these methods and we arrange for them to have children, maybe the infertility, if it is a genetic issue, is simply going to get passed on. People, I mean, well, you know this better than I.
And they already
It's
know
hard.
that infertile, sometimes parents, that is a concern if the parents had fertility issues, that's already the case
Right.
anyway.
Right. Any other questions or comments? Or? Well, thank you very much.
We're in a period of entitlement,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
entitlement
yeah,
mentality.
yeah.
Is there any
Well,
push?
not yet. I mean, it's insurance doesn't cover this stuff. It's very expensive. If I were to say, it may well be an opportunity for wealthy people, but not for poor people. So there's an inequality issue here. But I don't think anybody's yet reached a point of saying that we're entitled to have children in the sense of having the means to do this provided by third parties, whether it's government or
Somebody
insurance.
else's money.
I don't, we've quite got there, but it's part, you know, who knows? I mean, if we get to the point where these techniques get improve, become more common, less expensive, we may well reach a point where that becomes something that insurance policies might cover, or where,
They do, they
Yeah.
actually do.
do they?
Lots of things.
Yeah. What do they cover around
They
here?
cover IVF cycles.
Mhm. And that's expensive. That's you're talking big
So
bucks.
there's mandated states. Illinois is one of them, and
Mhm.
typically they'll cover up to 3 IVF cycles for a patient.
And that's what, 5,000-10,000?
Depends
For-
on the protocol.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty expensive stuff. So I was telling my students that they asked me about abortion. I said, I believe in postnatal abortion. I said, what? I said, I believe every parent should be allowed to snuff their kid out till they're 18. No questions asked. If you let them live beyond that, that's your problem. You know? I mentioned that in one class, and the student raised her hand and said, would you consider a friendly amendment? I said, sure. She says, if you want to keep the kid, but all 4 of your neighbors don't, do they have the right to overrule you? Yeah, maybe so. You know. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing with us today. And